This is Audible.
Eisenhorn, Malleus, by Dan Abnett. Read by Toby Longworth. By order of His Most Holy Majesty the God Emperor of Terra. Sequestered inquisitorial dossiers, authorized persons only. Case file 442-41F-JL3-KBU. Please enter your authority code. Validating. Thank you, Inquisitor. You may proceed. Classification: Primary Level Intelligence. Clearance: Obsidian. Encryption: Cryptox version 2.6. Date: 337.M41. Author: Inquisitor Yaves Thysa, Ordo Xenos. Subject: A matter for your urgent consideration. Recipient: Lord Inquisitor Phlebas Alessandro Raucan. Inquisition High Council Officio, Scarus Sector, Scarus Major. Salutations, Lord. In the name of the God Emperor, hallowed be his eternal vigil, and by the high lords of Terra, I commend myself, your highness, and hope I may speak plainly, in confidence, of a delicate matter. To begin generally, my work on Vogel Passionata is now complete, and my noble duty to the great Inquisition of mankind discharged successfully. My full documented report will follow in a few days, once my savants have finished compiling it, and I trust that your highness will find it satisfactory reading. To summarize, for the purpose of this brief missive, I am proud to declare that the malign influence of the so-called weird kin has been expunged from the hive cities of Vogel Passionata, and the inner circle of that obscene xenophile order broken forever and put to cleansing flame. Their self-proclaimed messiah, Gaethan Richter, is himself dead by my hand. A matter, however, has arisen from this. I am troubled by it, and unsure as to the best course of action. For this reason I am writing to you, Highness, in the hope of receiving guidance. Richter did not go without a fight, as you might expect. In the final bloody throes of the battle, as my combined forces stormed his fastness beneath the main hive, he called forth to oppose us a being of dreadful power. It slaughtered 19 of the Imperial Guardsmen assigned to my purge team, as well as Inquisitor Blucas, Interrogators Faruline and Seatmol, and Captain Ellen Ossel, my pilot. It would have slain me too, but for the strangest mischance. The being was an unholy thing, made like a man, but gleaming with an inner light. Its voice was soft, its touch was fire. I believe it was a demon host of unfathomable power, with the most vile propensity for spite and cruelty. My report will recount in detail the particular abominations this being subjected Seatmol and Ossel to before it destroyed them. I will spare you those dreadful facts here. Having disposed of Blucas, it cornered me on an upper landing in the fastness as I was penetrating the inner sanctum of the Weirdkin Messiah. My weapons did no harm to it, and it laughed gleefully as it threw me backwards down the length of the staircase with a casual flick of its wrist. Dazed, I looked up as it descended towards me, unable to conceive of a defense against it. I believe I may have clawed around to find my fallen weapon. That gesture caused it to speak. I report the words exactly. It said, "Don't worry now, Gregor. You are far too valuable to waste. Indulge me. Just a little scar to make it look authentic." Its talons tore across my chest and throat and ripped away my rebreather mask. The wounds will heal, they tell me, but they were deep and excruciating. The being then paused, as it saw my face properly for the first time, free from the mask set. Dreadful dark anger flared in its eyes. It said, "Forgive me, Highness, but this is the fact of it." It said, "You are not Eisenhorn. I have been tricked." I believe that it would have killed me there and then, but for the frontal assault of the Adeptus Astartes Aurora chapter, which tore into the hall at that precise moment. In the mayhem the being fled, though I cannot even now say how. Whatever the terrifying strength of the Adeptus Astartes, this thing was 100-fold more powerful. Later, on his knees, with my weapon to his head, seconds before his execution, Gaethan Richter begged for Cherubbaal to return. He wailed he could not understand why Cherubbaal had abandoned him. I believe he was speaking of the demon host. I trust your highness can see my trouble. Mistaking me for another of our kind, and an unimpeachably worthy example, I might add, this thing spared my life. It seemed to me, indeed, that it did so with pre-arranged connivance. Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn is highly regarded, numerously honored and justly praised as an example of all that is good, strong, and dogmatic about our brotherhood. However, since this circumstance I have begun to wonder, to fear that... I feel I cannot say what I wonder or fear. But I thought you should know of this, and know it soon. It is my belief that the Ordo Malleus should be informed, if only as a precaution. I hope and pray this matter will be found empty of truth and consequence, but as you taught me, sir, it is always better to be sure. Sealed as my true word by this my hand, this 276th day of the year 337.M41. The Emperor protects. Your servant, Thysa. Message ends. Chapter 1. I discover I am dead. Under dark fire, the lair of Sadia. Tantalid, unwelcome. As I grow older, may the Emperor protect me, I find I measure my history in terms of milestones. Those occurrences of such intense moment, they will never pass from one's memory. My induction into the blessed ordos of the Inquisition. My first day as a neophyte assigned to the great Hapshant. My first successful prosecution. The heretic Lemite sire. My elevation to full inquisitorial rank at the age of 24 standard years. The long drawn-out Nassau case. The affair of the Necrochuk. The Pigleo conspiracy. Milestones, all of them. Marked indelibly on to the engrams of my memory. And alongside them, I remember the dark night that came at the end of the month of Umbris, Imperial Year 338.M41, with particular clarity. For that bloody end was the start of it, the great milestone of my life. I was on Lethe 11, under instruction from the Ordo Xenos, deep in work, with the accursed xenophile Beldame Sadia almost in my grasp. 10 weeks to find her, 10 hours to close the trap. I had been without sleep for 3 days, without food and water for 2. Psychic phantoms triggered by the dark night eclipse were roiling in my mind. I was dying of binary poison. Then Tantalid turned up. To appraise you, Lethe 11 is a densely populated world at the leading edge of the Helican subsector, its chief industries being metalwork and shield technologies. At the end of every Umbris, Lethe's largest moon matches, by some cosmological coincidence, the path, orbit, and comparative size of the local star, and the world is plunged into eclipse for a 2-week period known as the Dark Night. The effect is quite striking. For the space of 14 days, the sky goes a cold, dark red, the hue of dried blood, and the moon, Cux, dominates the heavens, a peerlessly black orb surrounded by a crackling corona of writhing amber flame. This event has become, students of imperial ritual will be unsurprised to learn, the key seasonal holiday for all Lethians. Fires of all shape, size, and manner are lit as dark night begins, and the population stands vigil to ensure that none go out until the eclipse ends. Industry is suspended. Leave is granted. Riotous carnivals and firelit parades spill through the cities. Licentiousness and law-breaking are rife. Above it all, the dark fire of the eclipsed sun halos the black moon. There is even a tradition of fortune-casting, grown up around the interpretation of the corona's form. I had hoped to catch the beldame before dark night began, but she was one step ahead of me. Her chief poisoner, Pi, who had learned his skills in early life as a prisoner of the renegade Dark Eldar, so the story went, managed to plant a toxin in my drinking water that would remain inert until I ingested the second component of its binary action. I was a dead man. The beldame had killed me. My servant, Amos, accidentally discovered the toxin in my body and was able to prevent me from eating or drinking anything further. But graceless death beckoned me inexorably. My only chance of survival was to capture the beldame and her vassal Pi and extract the solution to my doom from them. Out in the dark streets of the city, my followers did their work. I had 80 loyal servants scouring the streets. In my rooms at the Hippodrome, I waited, parched, unsteady, distant. Ravenor came up trumps. Ravenor, of course. With his promise, it wouldn't be long before he left the rank of interrogator behind and became a full inquisitor in his own right. He found beldame Sadia's lair in the catacombs beneath the derelict church of St. Chiodrus. I hurried to respond to his call. "You should stay here," Beckwin told me, but I shook her off. "I have to do this, Elizabeth." Elizabeth Beckwin was by that time 125 years old. She was still as beautiful and as active as she had been in her 30s, thanks to discreet augmetic surgery and a regime of Juvenat drugs. Framed by the veil of her starched silk dress, her handsome face and dark eyes glared at me. "It will kill you, Gregor," she said. "If it does, then it is time for Gregor Eisenhorn to die." Beckwin looked across the gloomy candle-lit room at Amos, but he simply shook his ancient augmented skull sadly. There were times, he knew, when there was simply no reasoning with me. I went down into the street, where canister fires blazed and masked revellers capered and caroused. I was dressed all in black, with a floor-length coat of heavy black leather. Despite the flames around me, I was cold. Fatigue and the lack of nourishment were eating into my bones. I looked at the moon, threads of heat around a cold black heart. Like me, I thought. Like me. A carriage had been called for. 6 painted hippines, snorting and bridled, teamed to a stately landau. Several members of my staff waited nearby and hurried forward when they saw me emerge onto the street. I assessed them quickly. Good people all, or they wouldn't have made the cut to be here. With a few wordless gestures, I pulled out 4 to accompany me and then sent the rest back to other duties. The 4 chosen mounted the carriage with me. Mesha Kus, an ex-imperial guardsman from Vladislav, Arianod Esu Svedir, the swordswoman from Carthay, and Berenice and Zhu Zeng, 2 females from Beckwin's distaff. At the last moment, Berenice was ordered out of the carriage, and Elizabeth Beckwin took her place. Beckwin had quit active service with me 68 standard years before, in order to develop and run her distaff, but there were still times she didn't trust her people and insisted on accompanying me herself. I realized this was just such a time, because Beckwin didn't expect me to survive, and wanted to be with me to the end. In truth, I didn't expect to survive either. The carriage started off with a whip crack, and we rumbled through the streets, skirting around ceremonial fires and torchlit processions. None of us spoke. Kuss checked and loaded his autocannon and adjusted his body armor. Arianod drew her saber and tested the cutting edge with one of her own head hairs. Zhu Zeng, a native of Vitria, sat with her head down, her long glass robes clinking with the carriage's motion. Beckwin stared at me. "What?" I asked eventually. She shook her head and looked away. The church of St. Chiodrus lay in the waterfowlers' district, close to the edge of the city and the vast, lizard-haunted salt licks. The darkness throbbed with insect rhythms. The carriage stopped in a street of blackly rotting stone pilings, 200 meters short of the church's wrecked silhouette. The sky was amber darkness. Behind us, the city was alive with bright points of fire. The neighborhood around us was a dead ruin, slowly submitting to the salty hunger of the marshes. "Talon wishes Thorn. Rapturous beasts within," Ravener said over the Vox link. "Thorn impinging multifarious, the blades of disguise," I responded. My throat was dry and hoarse. "Talon observes moment. Taurus pathway requested. Pattern, ebony." "Pattern denied. Pattern crucible. Rose Thorn wishes hiatus." "Confirm." We spoke using glossia, an informal verbal code known only to my staff. Even on an open Vox channel, our communications would be impenetrable to the foe. I adjusted my Vox unit's channel. "Thorn wishes Aegis to me. Pattern crucible." "Aegis arising," Betancourt, my pilot, responded from far away. "Pattern confirmed." My gun cutter, with its fabulous firepower, was now inbound. I looked at the others in the shadow as I drew my weapon. "Now is the time," I told them. We edged into the gloomy, slime-swathed ruins of the church. There was a heady stink of wet corruption in the air, and sheens of salt clung to every surface. Clusters of maggot-like worms ate into the stones, and flinched back as the fierce beams of our flashlights found them. Cuss ran point, his autocannon swinging from side to side, hunting targets with the red laser rangefinder that projected from the corner of his bionically enhanced left eye. He was a stocky man, rippling with muscle under his harness of ceramite armor. He had painted his blunt face in the colors of his old regiment, the 90th Vladislavan. Arianod and I tailed him. She dulled her saber's blade with brick dust, but still it hooked the light as she turned it in her hands. Arianhod Esu Swedir was well over 2 meters tall, quite the tallest human woman I had ever met, though such stature is common amongst the people of faraway Carthay. Her long-boned frame was clad in a leather bodysuit, embossed with bronze studs, over which she wore a long, tasseled cloak of patchwork hide. Her silver hair was plaited with beads. The saber was called Barbariseta, and had been carried by women of the Esu Swedir tribe for 19 generations. From the braided grip to the tip of the curved, engraved blade, it measured almost 1.5 meters. Long, lean, slender, like the woman who wielded it. Already I could sense the vibration of the psychic energies she was feeding into it. Woman and blade had become one living thing. Arianhod had served with my staff for 5 years, and I was still learning the intricacies of her martial prowess. Ordinarily, I'd be noting every detail of her combat trance methods, but I was too fatigued, too drawn out with hunger and thirst. Bequin and Zuzeng brought up the rear, side by side, Bequin in a long black gown with a ruff of black feathers around the shoulders, and Zuzeng in her unreflective robes of vitrion glass. They stayed back far enough so the aura of their psychic blankness would not conflict with the abilities of Arianod or myself, yet close enough to move forward in defense if the time came. The Inquisition, and many other institutions, august or otherwise, had long been aware of the usefulness of untouchables, those rare human souls who simply have no psionic signature whatsoever, and thus disrupt or negate even the most strenuous psychic attack. When I first met her on Hubris a century before, Elizabeth Bequin had been the first untouchable I had ever encountered. Despite her unnerving presence, even non-psychers find untouchables difficult to be around. I had added her to my staff, and she had proved to be invaluable. After many years of service, she had retired to form the Distaff, a cadre of untouchables recruited from all across the Imperium. The Distaff was my own private resource, although I often loaned their services to others of my order. They numbered around 40 members now, trained and managed by Bequin. It is my belief that the Distaff was collectively one of the most potent anti-psycho weapons in the Emperor's domain. The ruins were festering with shadows and dank salt. Rot beetles scurried over the flaking mosaic portraits of long-dead worthies that stared out of alcoves. Worms crawled everywhere. The steady chirrup of insects from the salt licks was like someone shaking a rattle. As we probed deeper, we came upon inner yards and grave squares where neglect had shaken free place stones and revealed the smeared bones of the long interred in the loamy earth below. In places, rot-brown skulls had been dug out and piled in loose pyramids. It saddened me to see this holy place so befouled and dreary. Chiodrus had been a great man, had stood and fought at the right hand of the sacred Biti Sabat during her mighty crusade. But that had been a long time ago and far away, and his cult of worship had faded. It would take another crusade in the distant Sabbat worlds to rekindle interest in him and his forgotten deeds. Cuss called a halt and pointed towards the steps of an undercroft that led away below ground. I waved him back, indicating the tiny strip of red ribbon placed under a stone on the top step. A marker, left by Ravener, indicating this was not a suitable entry point. Peering into the staircase gloom, I saw what he had seen. The half-buried cables of a tremor detector and what looked like bundles of tube charges. We found 3 more entrances like it, all marked by Ravener. The beldame had secured her fastness well. Through there, don't you think, sir? Cuss whispered, pointing towards the columns of a roofless cloister. I was about to agree when Arianod hissed, "Barbarisator thirsts." I looked at her. She was prowling to the left, towards an archway in the base of the main bell tower. She moved silently, the sabre held upright in a two-handed grip, her tasselled cloak floating out behind her like angelic wings. I gestured to Cuss and the women, and we formed in behind her. I drew my prized bolt pistol, given to me by Librarian Britnoth of the Adeptus Astartes Death Watch chapter, on the eve of the Purge of Izar, almost a century before. It had never failed me. The beldame's minions came out of the night. 8 of them, just shadows that disengaged themselves from the surrounding darkness. Cuss began to fire, blasting back a shadow that pounced at him. I fired too, raking bolt rounds into the ghostly opposition. As befitted such a loyalty, she recruited only convicted murderers for her minions. The men who attacked us in that blighted yard were base killers, shrouded in shadow fields she had bought, borrowed, or stolen from her inhuman allies. One swung at me with a long-bladed halberd, and I blew off his head. Just. My body was tired, and my reactions were damnably slow. I saw Arianod. She was a balletic blur, her beaded hair streaming out above her flying cloak. Barbarisator purred in her hands. She severed the neck of one shadow with a backward slash, then pirouetted around and chopped another in two from neck to pelvis. The sabre was moving so fast I could barely see it. She stamped hard and reversed her direction of movement, causing a third shadow to sprawl as he overshot her. His head flew off, and the sabre swept on to impale a fourth without breaking its fluid motion. Then Arianod swept around, the sword held horizontally over her right shoulder. The steel haft of the fifth shadow's polearm was cut in two, and he staggered back. Barbarisator described a figure of 8 in the air, and another shadow fell, cut into several sections. The last minion turned and fled. A shot from Beckwin's las pistol brought him down. A pulse was pounding in my temple as I realized I had to sit down before I passed out. Cuss grabbed me by the arm and helped me down onto a block of fallen wall stone. "Gregor?" "I'm all right, Elizabeth. Give me a moment." "You shouldn't have come, you old fool. You should have left this to your disciples." "Shut up, Elizabeth." "I will not, Gregor. It's high time you understood your own limits." I looked up at her. "I have no limits," I said. Cuss laughed involuntarily. "I believe him, Mistress Beckwin," said Ravener, stepping from the shadows. Emperor damn his stealth. Even Arianod had not seen him coming. She had to force her sabre down to stop it slicing at him. Gideon Ravener was a shade shorter than me, but strong and well-made. He was only 34 years old. His long black hair was tied back from his sculpted, high cheek-boned face. He wore a grey body glove and a long leather stormcoat. The psi cannon mounted on his left shoulder whirred and clicked around to aim at Arianod. "Careful, swordswoman," he said. "My weapon has you squarely." "And it will still have me squarely when your head is lying in the dust," she replied. They both laughed. I knew they had been lovers for over a year, but still in public they sparred and sported with each other. Ravener snapped his fingers, and his companion, the festering mutant Gonvax, shambled out of hiding, drool stringing from his thick, malformed lips. He carried a flamer, the fuel tank strapped to the hump of his twisted back. I rose. "What have you found?" I asked Ravener. "The beldame, and a way in," he said. Beldame Sadia's lair was in the sacrarium beneath the main chapel of the ruin. Ravener had scouted it carefully, and found an entry point in one of the ruptured crypts that perhaps even she didn't know about. My respect for Ravener was growing daily. I had never had a disciple like him. He excelled at almost every skill an inquisitor is meant to have. I looked forward to the day when I supported his petition to inquisitorial status. He deserved it. The Inquisition needed men like him. Single file, we entered the crypt behind Ravener. He drew our attention carefully to every pitfall and loose flag. The stench of salt and old bones was intolerable, and I felt increasingly weak in the close, hot air. We emerged into a stone gallery that overlooked a wide subterranean chamber. Pitch lamps sputtered in the darkness, and there was a strong smell of dried herbs and fouler unguents. Beings were worshipping in the chamber. Worshipping is the only word I can use. Naked, daubed in blood, 20 depraved humans were conducting a dark Eldar rite round a torture pit in which a battered man was chained and stretched. The stink of blood and excrement wafted to me. I tried not to throw up, for I knew the effort would make me pass out. "There, you see him," Ravener whispered into my ear as we crawled to the edge of the gallery. I made out a pale-skinned ghoul in the distant shadows. "A homunculus, sent by the cabal of the Fell Witch to witness the Beldame's practices." I tried to make out detail, but the figure was too deep in the shadows. I registered grinning teeth and some form of blade device around the right hand. "Where's Pi?" asked Bequin, whispering too. Ravener shook his head. Then he seized my arm and squeezed. Even whispers were no longer possible. The Beldame herself had entered the chamber. She walked on 8 spider legs, a huge augmetic chassis of hooked arachnid limbs that skittered on the stones. Inquisitor Atalath, Emperor grant him rest, had destroyed her real legs 150 years before my birth. She was veiled in black gauze that looked like cobwebs. I could actually feel her evil, like a fever sweat. She paused at the edge of the torture pit, raised her veil with withered hands, and spat at the victim below. It was venom, squirted from the glands built into her mouth behind her augmetic fangs. The viscous fluid hit the sacrificial victim full in the face, and he gurgled in agony as the front of his skull was eaten away. Sadia began to speak, her voice low and sibilant. She spoke in the language of the Dark Eldar, and her naked brethren writhed and moaned. "I've seen enough," I whispered. "She's mine. Ravener, can you manage the homunculus?" He nodded. On my signal, we launched our attack, leaping down from the gallery, weapons blazing. Several of the worshippers were punched apart by Cuss's heavy fire. Whooping the battle cry of Carthay, Arianod flew at the homunculus, way ahead of Ravener. I realized I had pushed it too far. I was giddy as I landed, and stumbled. Her metal spider legs striking sparks from the flagstones, Beldame Sadia reared up at me, ululating. She pulled back her veil to spit at me. Abruptly, she reeled backwards, thunderstruck by the combined force of Bequin and Zuzeng, who flanked her. I gathered myself and fired at her, blowing one of the augmetic limbs off her spider frame. She spat anyway, but missed. The venom sizzled in the cold stone slabs at my feet. "Imperial Inquisition," I bellowed. "In the name of the hallowed God Emperor, you and your kind are charged with treason and manifest disbelief." I raised my weapon. She flew at me. Her sheer bulk brought me down. One spider limb stabbed entirely through the meat of my left thigh. Her steel fangs, like curved needles, snarled into my face. I saw her eyes for an instant, black and without limit or sanity. She spat. I wrenched my head around to avoid the corrosive spew and fired my bolt pistol up into her. The impact threw her backwards, all 400 kilos of wizened witch and bionic carriage. I rolled over. The homunculus had met Arianod's attack face on, the glaive around his right hand screaming as the Xenos-made blades whirled. He was stick-thin and clad in shiny black leather, his grin a perpetual consequence of the way the colourless skin of his face was pinned back around his skull. He wore metal jewellery, fashioned from the weapons of the warriors he had slain. I could hear Ravener crying out Arianod's name. Barbareseta sliced at the darting Eldar monster, but he evaded, his physical speed unbelievable. She swung again, placing 2 perfect kill strokes that somehow missed him altogether. He sent her lurching away in a mist of blood. For the first time since I had known her, I heard Arianod yelp in pain. Flames belched across the chamber. Gonvax shambled forward, forever loyal to his master and his master's lover. He tried to squirt flames at the homunculus, but it was suddenly somehow behind him. Gonvax shrieked as the glaive eviscerated him. With a howl, Arianod threw herself at the Dark Eldar. I saw her for a moment, frozen in mid-air, her sabre descending. Then the 2 bodies struck each other and flew apart. The sabre had taken off the Eldar's left arm at the shoulder, but his glaive. I knew she was dead. No one could survive that, not even a noble swordswoman from far Carthay. Bequin was pulling me up. "Gregor! Gregor!" Beldame Sadia, her spider carriage limping, was fleeing towards the staircase. Something exploded behind me. I could hear Ravener bellowing in rage and pain. I ran after the beldame. The upper chapel, above ground, was silent and cold. Dark night flares glimmered through the lines of stained glass windows. "You can't escape, Sadia!" I shouted, but my voice was thin and hoarse. I glimpsed her as she skittered between the columns to my left, a shadow in the shadows. "Sadia! Sadia, old hag! You have killed me, but you will die by my hand!" To my right now, another scuttling shadow, half seen. I moved that way. I was stabbed hard from behind, in between my shoulder blades. I turned as I fell, and saw the manic face of the beldame's arch-poisoner, Pi. He cackled and giggled, prancing, a spent injector tube clutched in each hand. "Dead, dead, 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 dead," he warbled. He had injected me with a secondary part of the poison. I fell over, my muscles already cramping. "How does it feel, Inquisitor?" Pi chuckled, capering towards me. "Emperor, damn you!" I gasped, and shot him through the face. I blacked out. When I came round, Beldame Sadia had me by the throat and was shaking me with her augmetic mandibles. "I want you awake," she hissed, her veil falling back, and the toxin sacs in her wizened cheeks bulging. "I want you awake to feel this." Her head exploded in a spray of bone shards and tissue. The spider carriage went into convulsions and threw me across the chapel. It continued to scuttle and dance, her corpse jerking slackly from it, for a full minute before it collapsed. I was face down on the floor, and I tried to turn, but the advancing effect of the poison was shutting me down hard. Massive feet strode into my field of vision, armored feet, plated with ceramite. I rolled as best I could, and looked up. Witchfinder Tantalid stood over me, holstering the bolt gun he had used to kill Beldame Sadia. He was encased in gold-encrusted battle armor, the pennants of the Ministorum suspended over his backplate. "You are an accursed heretic, Eisenhorn, and I claim your life." Not Tantalid, I thought as my consciousness spun away again. Not Tantalid. Not now. Chapter 2. Something so typically Betancourt. My fallen. The summons. From the moment I slipped into unconsciousness at the feet of the vicious witchfinder Tantalid, I knew nothing more until I woke, 29 hours later, aboard my gun cutter. I remembered nothing about the 7 attempts to shock my system back to life, the cardiac massages, the anti-venom shots injected directly into my heart muscle, the fight to make me live again. I learned all about it later, as I slowly recovered. For days I was as weak as a feline whelp. Most particularly, I knew nothing about the way Tantalid had been denied. Bequin told me, a day or two after my first awakening, it had been something so typically Betancourt. Elizabeth had been hard on my heels up the stairs from the sacrarium, in time to see Tantalid's arrival. She had known him at once. The witchfinder is notorious throughout the subsector. He'd been about to kill me, and I was unconscious at his feet, going into anaphylactic shock with the venom bonding and seething in my veins. She'd cried out, fumbling for her weapon. Then, light. Hard, powerful light had streamed in through the stained glass windows. There was a roaring sound. My gun cutter, its lamps on full beam, rose to a hover over the ruined chapel, lighting up the night. Guessing what was about to follow, Bequin had thrown herself down. Betancourt's voice had boomed out from the hull tannoy of the hovering gunship. "Imperial Inquisition! Step away from the Inquisitor now!" Tantalid had squinted up into the glare, his stringy tortoise head turning in the rim of his massive carapace armor. "Ministorum officer!" he had yelled back, his voice amplified by his suit's Vox unit. Back off now! This heretic is mine!" Bequin grinned as she told me Betancourt's response. "Never argue with a gun cutter, you asshole!" The slave servitors and the cutter's blunt wingtips opened fire, hosing the chapel with autocannon shells. The stained-glass windows had all shattered, statues had been decapitated, flagstones had disintegrated. Hit at least once, Tantalid had fallen backwards into the dust and debris. His body had not been found, so I presumed the bastard had survived. But he had been smart enough to flee. My prone body had not been touched, even though the chapel around me had been peppered with fire. Typical Betancourt bravado, typical Betancourt finesse. She was just like her damned father. "Send her to me," I told Bequin as I lay back in my cot, half dead and feeling terrible. Medea Betancourt looked in a few minutes later. Like her father Midas, she was clad in the red piped black suit of a Glavian pilot, and she proudly wore his old cerise embroidered jacket. Her skin, like Midas's, like all that of Glavian's, was dark. She grinned at me. "I owe you," I said. Medea shook her head. "Nothing my father wouldn't have done." She sat on the foot of my cot. "He'd have killed Tantalid, though," she decided. "He was a better shot." That grin again. Pearl-white teeth framed by ebony skin. "Yes, he was that." "But you'll do," I smiled. She saluted and left. Midas Betancourt had been dead for 26 years. I missed him still. He was the closest thing to a friend I had ever had. Bequin and Amos, they were allies, and I trusted them with my life. But Midas... May the God Emperor rot Fade Thurring for taking him. May the God Emperor lead me to Fade Thurring one day, so that I and Medea may avenge Midas. Medea had never known her father. She had been born a month after his death, raised by her mother on Glavia, and had come into my service by chance. I was her godfather, a promise to Midas. Duty-bound, I had visited Glavia for her ascension to adulthood, and watched her drive a Glavia longprow through the vortex rapids of the Stilt Hills during the rites of majority. One glimpse of her skills had convinced me. Arianod Esu Swidir was dead. So were Gonvax and Cuss. The battle in the Sacrarium had been fierce. Ravenor had killed the raging homunculus, but only after it had ripped open his belly and taken off Zhu Zeng's left ear. Gideon Ravenor was in intensive care in the main city infirmary of Lethe. We would collect him once he was out of danger. I wondered how long that would be. I wondered how he would be. He had loved Arianod, loved her dearly. I prayed this loss would not set him back too far. I mourned Cuss and the swordswoman. Cuss had been with me for 19 years. That dark night in the chapel had robbed me of so much. Cuss was buried with full honours in the Imperial Guard Memorial Cenotaph at Lethe Major. Arianod was burned on a bare hill west of the Salt Licks. I was too weak to attend either service. Amos brought the sabre Barbaris Satyr to me after the pyre. I wrapped it in a visicloth and a silk sheet. I knew I was duty-bound to return it to the tribal elders of the Esu Swedir on Carthay before long. That would mean a round trip of at least a year. I had